The words hung in the desert air like a funeral bell. Sarah's voice carried the weight of 1,000 buried dreams as she stood in the doorway of their ranch house, her wedding dress still smelling of sage and sorrow. The cowboy she'd married that morning, strong hands that could break wild horses, crumbled at her confession. In this vast, empty land where life struggled to take root, she had just declared their home barren. But love, she whispered, love could fill the silence where children's laughter would never echo. Subscribe to witness how two broken hearts forge something beautiful from the ashes of impossible dreams. The ranch house stretched before them like a promise that would never be kept. Sarah moved through the rooms with careful steps, her wedding dress trailing dust from the ceremony that had ended just hours ago. Each doorway she passed seemed to whisper of the children who would never run through these halls, never leave muddy footprints on the wooden floors her husband had laid with such hope. The silence pressed against her chest like a physical weight, and she found herself counting the empty bedrooms. 3 of them, waiting like open graves for dreams that would never take breath. Her husband, Thomas, stood in the kitchen doorway watching her with eyes that held too much understanding. He had known, of course. She had told him before they spoke their vows, had given him the chance to walk away from a woman whose body was a beautiful lie. But he had stayed, had promised her that love would be enough, that they would build something together that didn't require the blessing of children. Now, in the settling dust of their wedding day, those words felt fragile as spun glass, ready to shatter at the first real test of their resolve. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the emptiness of the space. Sarah touched the wall where a child's height might have been marked, where tiny handprints might have smudged the paint. Instead, there was only smooth wood, unmarked and waiting. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the house filled with something other than the echo of her own footsteps, but the silence was too complete, too final. It swallowed every hope she tried to nurture, leaving only the stark reality of rooms that would remain forever still. Thomas approached her slowly, his boots heavy on the floorboards. She could feel his presence behind her, warm and solid, but even his love couldn't fill the vastness of what they would never have. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, though her fingers felt cold despite the desert heat. They stood together in the empty room, 2 people trying to convince themselves that love could be enough to warm a house that would never know the chaos of children, never echo with young voices calling for their parents in the dark. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. Sarah watched them through the glass, those rootless things that wandered the desert without purpose or destination. She wondered if that's what they would become, 2 people drifting through a life that felt incomplete, forever searching for something to fill the spaces that were meant for other souls. The thought made her chest tighten with a grief so deep it felt like drowning, even as Thomas's hand anchored her to the present moment. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of loss and longing, Sarah finally spoke the words that had been burning in her throat since morning. "This house will never have children, but it will have love," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's hand tightened on hers, and she heard him draw a shaky breath, felt the tremor that ran through his strong frame. In that moment, she realized that her barrenness was not hers alone to bear. It was a wound they would carry together, a sorrow that would shape every day of their marriage like water-carving stone. Thomas had faced down stampeding cattle and broken wild mustangs with steady hands and an unshakable will. But Sarah's words brought him to his knees in a way that no physical challenge ever could. He sank into the kitchen chair, his hat falling to the floor as he buried his face in his hands. The tears came without permission, hot and shameful, each one carrying the weight of dreams he hadn't even known he'd been nurturing. He had imagined teaching a son to ride, had pictured a daughter with Sarah's gentle eyes learning to tend the garden. Now those phantom children dissolved like mirages in the desert heat, leaving only the bitter taste of loss. Sarah moved to him, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves, and placed her hands on his shoulders. He could feel her trembling, could sense the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. She had carried this knowledge alone for so long, had borne the weight of their shared disappointment in silence, while he had unknowingly built castles in the air. The guilt of his ignorance mixed with his grief, creating a cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him completely. He wanted to be strong for her, wanted to be the rock she could lean against, but in this moment he felt as fragile as a newborn colt. The ranch around them seemed to mock their sorrow with its endless fertility. The cattle grazed in fields that produced abundant grass. The horses bred successfully season after season. Even the wildflowers bloomed with reckless abandon across the desert floor. Nature's cruel irony was not lost on him. Everything on their land could create life except the two people who wanted it most desperately. He thought of his neighbors, the Hendersons, whose house overflowed with children's laughter, whose dinner table required constant expansion to accommodate their growing family. The comparison cut deep, leaving him feeling like a failure before their marriage had even truly begun. Sarah's fingers combed through his hair, a gesture so tender it made his chest ache with fresh grief. He looked up at her through his tears and saw his own pain reflected in her eyes, magnified by years of carrying this burden alone. She had chosen to marry him anyway, had walked down that makeshift aisle, knowing she could never give him the family he might want. The courage that must have required humbled him, made him ashamed of his tears, even as they continued to fall. She was the one who should be comforted, yet here she stood, offering solace to him while her own heart was breaking. The evening light faded around them, casting the kitchen in shades of purple and gold that reminded him of the bruises that came after a hard fall from a horse. He reached for Sarah's hands, pulling her down to sit beside him, needing her close enough to feel her warmth, to remind himself that love was still possible, even in the face of this devastating loss. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant call of a coyote to its mate. These were the sounds that would fill their evenings instead of children's bedtime stories, the soundtrack to a life that would be shaped by absence rather than abundance. When Thomas finally found his voice, it came out rough and broken, like a man who had been wandering the desert without water. "I love you," he said, the words carrying more weight than any vow they had spoken that morning. "Children or no children, I love you." Sarah's face crumpled at his declaration, and she fell into his arms, her own tears finally coming in great, shuddering sobs that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. They held each other in the gathering darkness, two wounded souls trying to find healing in their shared brokenness, while outside the desert wind sang its ancient song of survival against impossible odds. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of rooms that would never echo with children's laughter. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost haunting her own life, her bare feet silent against the wooden floors that Thomas had laid with such careful precision, dreaming of tiny footsteps that would never come. Each empty doorway felt like an accusation, each unused corner a reminder of the family portraits that would never hang on these walls. She paused at the threshold of what should have been a nursery, her hand resting against the doorframe where Thomas had carved their initials, surrounded by a heart, back when hope still lived in their bones like marrow. The silence in this room was different from the silence in the rest of the house. It was pregnant with absence, heavy with the weight of dreams that had died before they could take their first breath. Sarah could almost see the phantom crib that Thomas would have built with his own hands, could almost hear the lullabies she would have sung while rocking a child who existed only in the parallel universe of her imagination. The afternoon light streaming through the window illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, and she wondered if this was what souls looked like when they were searching for bodies to inhabit, forever wandering, forever homeless. Thomas found her there as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, standing motionless in the doorway like a sentinel guarding an empty tomb. He didn't speak, didn't try to pull her away from her vigil, because he understood that grief needed its rituals, its sacred spaces, its time to breathe in the thin air of loss. Instead, he stood beside her, his calloused hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining like roots seeking water in drought-stricken soil. Together, they stared into the emptiness that should have been fullness, two people learning to love the shape of their particular sorrow. The town had begun to whisper, as towns always do when faced with mysteries they cannot solve or tragedies they cannot fix. Sarah felt their eyes following her when she walked to the general store, felt their pity like a second skin she couldn't shed, heard their well-meaning words that cut deeper than any blade ever could. "God's will," they said, as if divine intention could somehow make the ache in her womb feel less like a constant dying. "Perhaps it's for the best," they murmured, as if her childlessness was a blessing disguised as a curse, as if the universe had somehow protected unborn children from a mother who was already proving herself unworthy. But in the sanctuary of their bedroom, when the world had gone to sleep and only the coyotes sang their lonely songs to the stars, Thomas would hold her against his chest and whisper truths that the daylight was too harsh to hear. He told her that her worth wasn't measured in her ability to bear children, that her love wasn't diminished by her empty arms, that she was complete exactly as she was, broken and beautiful and perfectly imperfect. His words were like water on parched earth, soaking into the cracked places of her heart, nurturing something new and tender that had nothing to do with motherhood, and everything to do with the fierce, protective love that grows between two people who have weathered storms together. The chapter closed with Sarah's whispered confession in the darkness. "I'm afraid I'll forget how to hope." And Thomas's response, soft as a prayer against her hair, "Then I'll remember for both of us, until you're ready to hope again." 3 months after the doctor's pronouncement had shattered their world, like glass against stone, a stranger arrived in their small town, riding a mare the color of autumn leaves. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with silver-streaked hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of someone who had loved deeply and lost much. The townspeople watched her with the suspicious curiosity reserved for outsiders, but Sarah felt drawn to her like a moth to flame, sensing in this stranger a kindred spirit who understood the particular geography of grief. The woman introduced herself as Elena, and she carried with her a wagon full of orphaned children from the Eastern Territories, children whose parents had been claimed by disease, by violence, by the 1,000 small tragedies that carved families apart on the frontier. She spoke of these children not as burdens to be placed, but as seeds waiting for the right soil, as hearts seeking other hearts to call home. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Elena tended to the children in the town square, her movements gentle and sure, her voice carrying across the dusty street like a lullaby made of hope and determination. Thomas found Sarah standing at that window for hours, her palm pressed flat against the glass, as if she could somehow reach through it to touch the lives unfolding before her. He saw the hunger in her eyes, the way she catalogued each child's face, each gesture, each moment of joy or sorrow that played across their young features. There was a little girl with dark curls who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, and a boy with serious eyes who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders, and twins who clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to the same piece of driftwood. When Elena knocked on their door that evening, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. The older woman's eyes were kind but direct, cutting through pretense with the efficiency of someone who had learned that life was too short for anything but truth. "I've been watching you watch them," Elena said simply, settling into the chair Thomas offered her at their kitchen table. "And I've been watching them watch you back." Love recognizes love, even across the distance of strangers. Her words hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed, like an invitation to step into a different version of their story. Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest. Not the painful breaking that had become so familiar, but something else. A door that had been locked tight, suddenly swinging wide to let in light. She thought of the empty rooms in their house, of the love that had nowhere to go, of the way her arms ached not just with loss, but with the desperate need to hold, to protect, to nurture something precious and fragile and real. Thomas reached for her hand across the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, and she knew that he was thinking the same thing, feeling the same impossible hope blooming in the ruins of their original dreams. The evening ended with Elena's gentle suggestion that they might visit the children tomorrow, not to decide anything, but simply to see what their hearts told them when faced with the possibility of love taking a different shape than they had imagined. Sometimes, Elena said as she prepared to leave, the children we're meant to love aren't the ones we give birth to, but the ones who give birth to the parents we're meant to become. Dawn broke over the town like a promise being kept, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to whisper of new beginnings. Sarah woke before Thomas, her body humming with an energy she hadn't felt in months, as if something dormant inside her had suddenly remembered how to bloom. She dressed carefully, choosing her blue calico dress, the one Thomas said brought out the color of her eyes, and braided her hair with hands that trembled not with fear, but with anticipation. Today felt different, charged with possibility, heavy with the weight of decisions that could change everything. The children were staying in the church basement, their temporary beds arranged in neat rows like a garden of sleeping flowers. Sarah and Thomas approached the building with the reverence of pilgrims approaching a shrine, their footsteps echoing off the wooden sidewalk in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, like hope made audible. Elena met them at the door, her smile warm as summer sunshine, and led them down the stairs into a world that smelled of soap and childhood and the particular sweetness of innocence preserved despite hardship. The dark-haired little girl was the first to notice them, her enormous brown eyes tracking their movement across the room with the intensity of someone who had learned early that adults could disappear without warning. She was perhaps 6 years old, with a heart-shaped face and a way of holding herself that suggested both vulnerability and fierce independence. When Sarah knelt down to her level, the child didn't speak, but something passed between them, a recognition that transcended words, a knowing that some connections are written in the stars long before they manifest on earth. "Her name is Maria," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her parents died of fever last winter. She hasn't spoken much since then, but she watches everything, remembers everything. She's been waiting for something, though I think she couldn't have told you what." Sarah extended her hand, palm up, an offering without expectation, and after a long moment that felt like eternity, Maria placed her small fingers against Sarah's palm. The touch was electric, transformative, like the moment when a key finds its lock and everything clicks into place. Thomas watched his wife's face transform as she interacted with Maria, saw the way the shadows that had lived in her eyes for months began to recede, replaced by something luminous and alive. The boy with serious eyes, Miguel Elena called him, approached Thomas with the careful dignity of someone much older than his 8 years, and soon they were deep in conversation about horses and ranching and the 1,000 small details that make up a life lived close to the land. The twins, Ana and Carlos, orbited around them all like small planets finding their gravitational center, their laughter beginning to fill the spaces between words. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Sarah felt something she had thought was lost forever beginning to stir in her chest, the fierce, protective love of a mother, different from what she had imagined but no less real, no less powerful. These children needed what she had to give, and she needed what they offered in return, the chance to love without reservation, to build a family not from her body but from her heart. to discover that sometimes the most beautiful things in life are the ones we never planned for. When Eleanor asked if they would like to take the children home for a trial period, Sarah looked at Thomas and saw her own answer reflected in his eyes. Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. The chapter ended with Maria's small hand slipping into Sarah's as they walked toward the wagon that would carry them to their new life, and Sarah's whispered promise to the little girl who had chosen to trust her. "You're home now, sweetheart. You're finally home."